So a few more words of clarification. Yeah, I used to be, I am now actually on leave from Sorbonne, which used to be called the University Pierre et Marie Curie. So now Pierre et Marie Curie is only a campus of that larger university called Sorbonne, and there are 5 or 6 campuses around Paris. So that explains the new logo here. And for the past 2 years, I was supported by a foundation in England called the Leverhulme Trust, and which supports science projects and as a fellowship program for visiting professors. And that allowed me actually to spend my time at the Institute of Philosophy, which is part of the School of Advanced Study at the University of London. And so it's an interesting place. I encourage you to actually take a look at the website of the Institute of Philosophy. There is a particular center called the Center for the Study of the Senses, and which is inside the Institute of Philosophy, where actually, where people meet. It's really a place where people meet weekly, and you also have some permanent researchers and postdocs, and a very well-equipped lab. And then people meet there to discuss senses in general, from the lowest level, like things I do, to cognition and social issues. So that's a very good place to be. And you have specialists of vision and audition sometime, and also of olfaction, which is a very important sense, olfaction and taste. And so that's what I do there. I have a couple of studies ongoing, still ongoing, which have to do with cognition. I'll give you one example. Actually 2 examples of results that came out. We have we made a study which compared the senses in terms of the experience of confidence you have when you make a perceptual judgment. So that's a really fundamental brain function, is to be able to assess whenever you make a decision, whether that decision is good or bad. So that particular field is called metacognition. It means that actually the brain, obviously, is capable of assessing its own performance. And so, for example, it's a very common occurrence when you walk into a room and there's not sufficient light, then actually you would actually automatically put more confidence on your sense of touch because you just cannot see. And then of course your brain is capable of telling that actually touch is more efficient when there is no light. And so we studied that phenomenon, comparing how the brain would judge tactile performance versus visual performance in a situation where precisely the judgments are ambiguous. So we managed, by an experimental trick, to achieve a point where actually you would not be sure which one would be the better one, and also the judgment to be made was very hard, just at the limit whether you could actually judge. It was just the length of a stick, essentially. And what we found is that actually the performance of the tactile experience, in general, for this very ambiguous stimuli right at the threshold of discrimination, would be lower than vision. A good reason for that, because it's actually slower. But people actually put more trust in their tactile judgment. So that was really interesting. It's hard to explain why is it that you would have a sensory channel that would be more trusted when in fact it would be less efficient. So that's an interesting result. It has a historical background. The philosophers of the Enlightenment all believed that actually touch was teaching the other senses. It's been written by de Condillac and Berkeley and Descartes, and they all put the sense of touch at the forefront in the sense that it was more reliable. And of course, in modern science, we know it's all a matter of circumstances and task. But still, there is this belief, which is that the sense of touch is more trustworthy. So that's interesting. It has application, of course, in all kinds of domains. It's been observed many times that actually in marketing studies, that if people can touch the object that they would like to buy, then they would buy them more. And it's a very good example of that is the Apple store, where you actually walk in and you can actually touch the goods, and that makes people believe that actually they work. So that's interesting. But there are many other applications of that result, actually. So that's what another project that is ongoing, also at the Institute, has to do with taste. And taste and olfaction, actually taste itself, quite a bit of it is actually tactile, or what we would say scientifically, it's somatosensory, meaning that the neural signals that come from inside the mouth are in part chemical, like from the tongue, but in part mechanical or pseudo-mechanical. For example, hot foods or menthol actually drive the somatosensory system. And this is why when you drink something that contains menthol, then it feels cold, because you actually drive the cold receptors. And so that's interesting. And that gave us the idea that actually also in perception there is a class of phenomena which is important to study, because it actually tells a lot about the way the brain deals with ambiguity. These studies have to do with rivalry, meaning that actually you provide stimuli which are completely contradictory. And when rivalry occurs, then your brain actually takes one interpretation and then oscillates between one and the second, and in time. Okay, so a famous example of that is the the Necker cube. You've all heard of it, I'm sure. I'll try to make one here. If you draw a square, you see a square, but you can also make it 3D. And if you also draw the back face, then you create an ambiguous stimulus, which could represent a square viewed from the front, like this, or it could be a square which is viewed from under. Okay, and then once you know that, then you will see the two figures. And then if you watch that, actually every 8 seconds, then your brain switches from one interpretation to the other. It's pretty interesting. And then so it happens in all modalities. You can create stimuli that are rival. And then so we tried to create a stimuli that was rival for taste, hoping that you would have a taste in your mouth that would switch from one quality to the other in time. And so what we did actually is actually take a mixture of menthol that would create a fresh sensation in your mouth, and then a capsaicin, which creates hotness, so what you have in peppers. And we made a cocktail, we dosed it, and then we are hoping that actually you would have a conflicting experience, whether it's cold or hot. It cannot be the two at once. and what happened is that the brain resolved the conflict, not in time like in vision, but in space. So what happens when you drink that mixture, you have a sensation of a cold object which is surrounded by heat in a sort of a spherical object in your mouth, which is really interesting. It's a new way of resolving rival stimuli, but in space instead of time. And you could probably explain it or give an interpretation to that, because taste is a very slow sense. It takes a long time to actually for the chemical reaction to take place and being processed by your brain. But anyway, so that's what I'm doing there. And I spent half of my time at a small company called Electronica, which was started 3 years ago. And the basic idea is that you all have experienced already haptic technologies, like things that give you tactile feedback. It's well known in games, the rumble. Okay, it's also available in most telephones now, and it's particularly nicely done in Apple telephones. You have very nice clicks and buttons. And so the idea of our company is actually to make this kind of technology available to more companies than big companies. So we actually designed a little kit which contains actuators and computers, and they provide tactile feedback, and then we work with other companies to include it in their products. So you will never see our product, you will see the results of them. So that's what we do, and we're actually hiring now. So if you're interested, come and talk to me. We have a...
How much do you pay, Vincent?
Depends. Why do we have tactile sensation? It's a question worth asking. There are really two broad reasons why you have such sensitive appendages, like hands and feet, and the whole body for that matter. And the number one justification or reason why we actually evolved to have such sensitive appendages is to manipulate, is to actually hold objects and then do something with them, use them like tools, or and then or eat, or so that's manipulation is almost impossible if you don't have sensitive hands. Walking is completely impossible if you don't have sensitive feet, because you are enabled to assess the quality of the floor on which you walk, whether it's slippery, or whether it's soft, or whether it's granular, or whether it's etc. So there are many studies that show that actually tactile inputs are essential to walking. You can actually notice that sometimes one of the consequences of diabetes is to lose tactile sensitivity, and then it's actually noticeable in people from the way they walk in a sort of very slow and unstable manner because of that. So that's one reason why our hands and bodies actually have, and the huge brain machinery behind has evolved to cater for manipulation. And the second is actually to assess the world, is actually to know what things are, which is a little different from the manipulative function. Is to actually to know the shape, the materials, what things are, and the sense of touch is incredibly good at it. at telling what the nature of objects that surround us. A good example of that, there is an entire industry which relies on this fact. It's basically simulated plastics, like Formica and stuff like that. You can make simulated wood, and then when you walk into a kitchen or room, you actually think that it's made of wood. But within milliseconds, you put your hands on the material, you realize it's made of plastic. And so the sense of touch is incredibly efficient at identifying what are the materials that are being touched. And for that, it's really the king of senses to know if something is made of stone or plastic or wood, etc. And also it has a function which is hedonistic, as has been commented many times. So there's quite a bit of literature on that, on the hedonic function of touch, of course. And also what that picture shows is that it has an extraordinary sensitivity. It's possible, like if you have a very small object, like smaller than a micron, you can actually detect it tactily very easily. For example, if you have a speck of dust between your two fingers and you run your fingers like this, you immediately realize that there is a very, very small object there. If you make a lab measurement, you realize that actually with your hand, you can detect vibrations that are in the 100 nanometer range. So it's very, very sensitive. It's a very sensitive sense. It's actually a really good question. Why is it that we evolved to have such an incredible sensitivity to vibrations? It doesn't seem to make sense that we evolved it because to detect earthquakes. It has. So I have some ideas that will hopefully come up as I show examples. Why is it that it's so useful to be able to detect not vibrations themselves, but the nature of vibrations, a certain aspect of them? And so this is to give you an idea of how, yeah, of course, complicated touch is. You all know that when you put your finger on glass, like this, and I do this, and when I slide my finger on the glass, I have a sensation of, what do I feel? I feel glass, and I feel flat. So I have a sensation of geometry, of flatness, and I have a sensation of material, it's glass. But what is it? What is the message that is picked up by the finger and sent to the brain? So long time ago, we had this idea that we could actually measure it, and then develop a means to actually record it and then replay it. So that was the objective then. It never worked, but it's still a really good idea. And I'll show you what happens when your finger slides on your telephone. You obtain this kind of mechanics, which are really interesting. They arise from the fact that your skin is soft and elastic. Actually, it's soft and viscoelastic. And it has friction against surfaces. And what you're seeing here is the manner in which the skin make a transition between sliding and slipping. So that's what friction does. It prevents objects in contact from moving. That's what it does. It really resists any motion, and up to a certain level where actually a slip occurs. Okay, so that's what friction does. But in a contact, it does it on the surface. So it's very different from the way of thinking that you've learned in high school, like the Coulomb friction, where you have like two solid objects, which are, if you want, represented by points. But the real physics, there is no point. There's bodies and surfaces. and then what happens is something complicated, like you've seen. In fact, I'll play it again because it's interesting. And what it shows that actually in most contact, the skin slips at the periphery before it slips at the middle, and then you have a transitioning dynamics, which is actually quite difficult to model for a simple reason. If you are a bit familiar with differential equations, the problem of this kind of mechanical problem is a type of problem that is called free boundary, meaning that the boundary which separates the zone which slips from the zone that sticks moves all the time. So the boundary conditions change. So the solution creates a new boundary, and the new boundary creates a new solution. So it's a free boundary problem, which is of the worst kind possible. It has many interesting properties, of course, but the information that reaches your experience is still something quite simple. It's glass and flat. And so what is in between this signal, which is, so each time you see a little white dot here, it's a sweat pore in your finger. And then you can imagine that around each sweat pore you have like about 4 mechanoreceptors, and of the type that respond to transients. And then you have about 1 mechanoreceptor that responds to sort of steady stimulation. And so each time you do this, then you have a tremendous amount of neural activity in your fingertip, which is set up the pathway and then eventually becomes glass and shape. And when Tony actually organized a wonderful conference a couple of years ago, that was at the Kavli Center, where he had Tony had the gracefulness of invited me and think about theoretical ideas. And that's actually this idea. I think it has been very useful for me. Maybe it'll be useful for you. It's about trying to see what is exactly your senses are doing. So in the realm of vision, it of course has been a problem for a long time, since Helmholtz and many scientists are trying to decide what is it that your sense of vision is doing. And in the more modern ways, actually, it's been sort of quite well understood how the natural vision really seems to work. Although, of course, it's still a completely open problem, but there's quite a nice theory about it. And it starts from a simple idea, is that the light field in which you live, like this one, actually is contrary to your intuition. It's not a 3-dimensional space like the physical space. It is actually a 7-dimensional space. And that's pretty easy to figure out, actually. If you take every photon that is traveling in this room, then it's basically tracing a ray, so a straight line. And that straight line is parameterized by 5 numbers. You need a point in which it goes through, plus 2 angles for the orientation, makes 5 numbers. So every photon is parameterized by 5 numbers, plus a color, plus a time-varying component. So everything that's to be seen in a room has 7 dimensions. And what the eyes do, they reduce the number of dimensions. And using optics, you actually project this light field on a surface, like in the camera, and then you make it 2D. So you actually make a reduction of dimension. And if you have a camera, then you have 3D. And so the visual system does something a bit like that, clearly. It really reduces the number of dimension, quite differently from a camera, but it does it nonetheless. And then uses, and also has, so the retina is not an imager like a camera. It's actually a computer. And what the retina does, it at the very beginning, the very first neural layers of the retina actually produce even more dimensional reductions right at the beginning, so or to make the whole process of vision possible. So that's an interesting idea. Adelson talked about it. Condering and many scientists really discuss this idea of dimensional reduction in vision in a very beautiful way. But the question is, can you discuss that in the same manner for touch? Is it possible to describe in a sort of systematic manner how the number of dimensions is reduced so you can actually have sensations and not just a mess? And so the answer is it's not really doable, I think, at this point, and I explain why. Essentially, the act of touching is making two bodies interact. That's what happens in a mechanical sense. And so, for example, you have a body A and a body B. B would be the sensor or the perceiver, and then A is the floor or my telephone or another person. And basically what happens is when the two bodies interact, they both change shape. That's mechanics at the moment of contact. And then the job of the perceiver B is to guess something useful about A from its own change of shape. So that's what the problem is. So that's intriguing. So you can go back to continuum mechanics to try to get a handle on the problem. I don't know if you have an engineering background. Do you? Then you may remember continuum mechanics courses. They are horrible. They have fluid mechanics and solid mechanics. Anyway, that's where the stuff is actually. But there's a little problem. Is in the title, it's continuum. So really, the shape of bodies and how they evolve through time is a continuum, meaning that you have to have an infinite number of dimensions to be able to talk about it. So if you have a liquid, then you have the Navier-Stokes equation, and if you have a solid, then you have the solid equations, and so on. And that's where actually what happens whenever you walk and touch and manipulate. So it's clearly not simple to invert it, to actually learn something about A from something about B. But it can be done, of course. And for example, people doing virtual reality, not even thinking about these questions, they do it naturally. And they will assume that, for example, the interaction can be summarized by a single number. That could be one way, instead of having an infinite number of numbers, then you have just one, a scalar, okay? So that's possible to do. For example, the scalar could be a function of how much you indent. So that's a highly simplified version of the real world, but it can be justified in certain cases. And in fact, the local deformation assumption is not so bad, because it corresponds to a very important principle in mechanics called the Saint-Venant principle. And what it says that actually if you deform bodies, solid bodies, at one place, then the consequences of the deformation vanish very quickly. So that's important. Like, for example, if you take a bar and then you put it in a vise in a workshop and you squeeze the bar with your vise, then you will make a dent in the bar and it will be local. There will be no consequence far away. Okay. So that's called Saint-Venant principle. That's essentially how you build machines. And it has exceptions, of course. For example, a sheet of paper is an exception. You can take a sheet of paper and bend it, and then you can have a local interaction and then a faraway consequence. So that's why it's a principle. It's not more than that. But for touching, it's very important. It means that when I put my finger on the blackboard here, then I can make the assumption that actually there is only consequences at near the contact. So that's a very useful way, which actually turns out to be wrong, as I will show later. So it really makes this notion of assumptions very important to make sure what is assumed and what is assumed is not always true. For example, you have examples like that. Other, you can have special cases like a rigid object and a rigid probe. So the first case is what you have when you go to the mechanical shop and you take a caliper and you measure the size of an object in a caliper. And then you learn something about the object from the state of the caliper, assuming that there is no deformation. So they are both rigid. And that's how you can tell that an object has a certain size. But if one of them is soft, it no longer is true. Actually, if you go take a piece of rubber and try to measure it, you don't have its size. You don't really know, actually. So you can have rigid object and soft probe, like what happens a lot in everyday life. You have soft fingers, but the objects that you touch often are more rigid than the finger. And if we have time, I'll give examples on how that can be worked out, and so on. And the last point is really crucial to have an idea about how touch operates, is that you have to think of it always in nonlinear terms. So there's always effects that are nonlinear in mechanics, and that's what makes it so rich and interesting. Here is an example where, say, a doctor goes and does palpation and tries to find out if you have a lump. Okay, so that's something you do by touch. And then you will notice that the doctor actually is moving the finger around the lump. And they'll say, oh, yes, yeah, you're real sick. Okay. And like here, for example. And so why do you move? It's because essentially you create a mechanical phenomenon called buckling, which makes actually the state of the mechanical state depend on the trajectory. So it's exemplified here. You have an initial contact here. You push down first, and then the lump goes on the side. It's pushed on the side. And then you keep pushing, and it's more on the side. So if this finger is sensitive, then it will find that actually the lump is on this side, on the right side. Now you have a second gesture, the different strategy. Before pushing down, you push sideways, and then the lump flips on the other side. So you buckle. And then when you push down, it ends up in a different state. So you have identical initial states, different trajectories, and different final states. And that alone is sufficient to tell that actually there is a rigid object embedded in soft tissues. And so that's a very interesting strategy, which comes from the properties of mechanics. And there are many like this, and many, of course, arise from friction, which is the most nonlinear thing you can ever think of, and makes really life possible. And of course, because the problem of that your brain is solving in touching objects is so ill-defined and complicated that there are many illusions that can be elicited in the tactile domain. That's the one that's shown here was described by Aristotle a long time ago. And you can actually do it when you cross your fingers like this, like on the picture here. And then you go and touch an object which is round. And then if you don't look at it, then you would actually feel two objects. And the reason for that, of course, you can talk about it a long time. It's interesting, yeah? So you have two telephones now. And essentially it's because your brain is solving this perceptual problem from your mobile hands. And they are really mobile. But they are not mobile in an infinite number of ways. They are always adopting these grasping postures. So you never go and eat with your fingers like this. You most often use your fingers in a natural manner. So basically, this particular configuration is not taken into account by the processes. And then so the resolution for it is having two objects instead of one. It works the other way also. It's pretty nice. You cross your fingers and you find a corner of a room and you touch the two walls on the sides, and then the walls become flat. It works. So that gives. We don't have much. A lot of illusions can fall into all kind of different categories, and as my first movie was trying to show, I mean, the number of ambiguities is enormous. Okay, so here is a very simple case of mechanics where the ambiguity is made more clear. Okay, you take a comb like this one, and then you touch the comb with your finger, and then if the bristles of the comb are close enough, then you feel like a line. You don't really feel the bristles anymore when they are at 1.2 millimeter apart, and then you feel a line. And what you do, you arrange for a small contraption to push bristles apart locally. So what that does actually is create a displacement in one direction and the other direction. And then, so essentially the gray line here shows the displacement. And then one simple computational simplification of what the transduction process is actually, that what you feel is actually the gradient of the displacement. So essentially the gradient of displacement is the strain, is how much your tissue has been strained. Okay, so the strain is the first derivative, so it gives you a function like this one. And it turns out from the contact mechanics that this particular strain is the same one that would be given if you have a punch pushing inside your finger. Okay, so that's interesting. And you do feel a punch, actually. But the strain field is being rotated by sort of 90 degrees. So instead of being, when you punch inside the finger, then you would have a principal direction, which is normal. And here, the principal direction is lateral. But if you make the assumption that the mechanoreceptors are not sensitive to orientation, then the signal is the same. And actually, the sensation is really very much the same if you have that particular contraption well designed. So that's one source of tactile illusions is the basic law of mechanics. Just like for optical illusions, the basic laws of optics can give rise to certain class of illusion. Another one here. Yeah.
When you're saying that you feel a sensation, like how do you measure this? Is it self-report?
It could be self-report. If you do yeah, it's an interesting question actually. Self-report is the best, but often when you write papers about illusions, the reviewers don't believe you, and especially when it comes to tactile illusions. So I've been struggling with that problem for a quarter century, essentially. And the best way to go about it is to create a perceptual task, like how big or how wide, something like that. And then you have a real stimulus. And then you have an illusory stimulus. And then you essentially create a perceptual equivalent function by in a parameterized manner. So that actually is a pretty convincing method. And even more convincing is when you can blend a real stimulus with an illusory stimulus and show that they actually combine, say, using a simple law like additive. And in that case, then it's even more convincing because then the brain doesn't take two different signals, it's really used them as one. So that's the only two methods I've found so far.
And for the weight?
This one? Well, this one, is, as I said, it was discovered in 1886, if I recall. The original paper is, it's just self-report. It's really fun to read, actually. And since then, there have been literally hundreds of papers on it, either using scaling methods or perceptual equivalent methods. Recently, I had a study related to this illusion using a technique called the single stimulus. So instead of comparing two stimuli, you actually, like for example, then you have a series of stimuli that vary parametrically in a random manner, and you compare your sensation to an internal standard. And it's actually an excellent method. It's become very popular now. It's faster, it has less biases than a standard comparison type well, each of these methods have different advantages and drawbacks depending on what you'd want to do and what you can also, within the time and the statistics you want to obtain.
I think for the size of the illusion, I've seen also EMG.
Yes, yeah, neural collates, of course, yeah.
So they're like recording like
Yeah. If actually the one I'm showing here, it's been tested on, it's never been published, but there was a short study on using a neural collate method called the transmagnetic stimulation. So you actually attenuate the activity in a region of the brain. And actually this particular shape sensation I was about to talk about can be abolished by I think, if I recall, we never finished it, but I recall it was destimulating S2. Like it's a particular area of the somatosensory cortex, which shows that actually it was really a shape, because that would be, you would have the same abolishment if you have the real shape. So yeah, this one is interesting. It's essentially the belief is that when you put your hands on an object, the shape of the object is perceived through the position of your fingers. But in fact, there's a lot more information available to your fingers when you hold an object than just where they are in space. And what we show that actually the most reliable information is not the position of the fingers, it is actually the perceived normal of the object. So independently from its position. And so that's interesting. It was known from actually a long time ago through static cases, but we have here a dynamic. It's more precisely speaking, it's a kinetic version. And so this particular machine I just showed allowed us actually to dissociate the information coming from finger movement from where the normal would be estimated at the contact. And what you get, actually, you can actually make a graph, which actually, okay, so what this comes from is the fact that every sensory problem has an aperture problem, meaning when you obtain information through your eyes, ears, or fingers, or mouth, then you have only a small window on the world. For example, when you look, you only see a very small foveal region sharply. And so you have an aperture problem. It's like looking through a little hole, if you want. So you have to guess the rest. And so fingers are like this. They have an aperture problem. When you put your finger on a surface, you get information from a centimeter square. That's all. And then so you have to guess the rest. So that's why you move your hands. And then the question is, what is the information that's the most useful? Okay. And then the way you can reason about it, it's by orders. So zero order would be like positional information about an object. First order would be the slope. Second order would be curvature, and so on. And using different studies, including our own, we could make sort of a space of all apertures. It's actually fairly easy to figure why. If you have a finite aperture and then you have a certain shape, then you can actually you can know its curvature or its slope, right? And then you can see which one is the most reliable in the presence of noise, of uncertain information. And then you find out, actually, it's pretty nice, for all apertures that are of the centimeters scale, then the curvature is the most reliable information, which is what happens when I squeeze the chalk here. I really feel the curvature directly. And that's what my brain uses, actually. But if it's a little bigger, between 1 centimeter and say a meter, then the slope is more reliable. And then it's even bigger than its position. So if you hug a big tree or an elephant, then which is then it's the position that matters. Okay. So, and as far as I can tell, this particular graph here is the only quantitative sort of model of haptic perception that I was ever published. All the others are sort of qualitative or small cases, but here we have a model that spans a big space, so it's a nice thing to remember, and it's very useful, of course, when you design haptic interfaces, to have this knowledge in I'll skip that. Yeah, so that's an interesting consequence also of the manner in which a machine or an animal can resolve ambiguity is actually to have prior assumptions and prior knowledge about what is being touched. And of course, the laws of mechanics, of physics, are invariant knowledge. They are always true. You can count on them, like gravity, like vibrations. Actually, in mechanical domain, the modes of vibrations are really essentially things that you can rely on. Okay. And then here, there is a class of material that's, which is important to us. They are not liquids, they're not solids, they're in between. And this class of material is are called granular, like sand and earth, or even a piece of wood can be seen as granular. It's made of fibers, which is when you bend it and you crack it, it doesn't behave like a piece of plastic. It cracks by little jumps. Okay, and so the granular or fibrous class of material is really important to us, and it's really actually so important that most of things on the planet are like this. There is very little engineering materials. There is mostly sand and wood and leaves, you know, things that are made of little pieces that are interacting. And so we'll get to that. Actually, all these materials share an important property that will come obvious in a minute. But first, here we created that experimental condition. We have a display here, and it is made of many little tractors, moving places. And then we can move them in synchrony or individually. We can do a lot of different stimuli with them. And of course, they engender stimuli in your fingers that you can feel. And then we have this experimental condition where they're all moved in phase here, boom, boom, like this. In the second condition, they'll move out of phase. So every neighbor would move in counter phase with each other. And you can actually work out from a mechanical and a neural perspective that in the in phase provides 100-fold less mechanical stimulation than the antiphase. It's normal because you have very little strain. Okay? Whereas here you're actually generating maximal strain. So, and then we've actually verified in the lab that it creates tremendous neural activity. The stimulus is a little funny. The way it works is that you push on the surface, and the slope, I mean, the rate of load increase determines the frequency. Okay, so if I push steady, I get no stimulation. If I push fast, I get more. Okay, and you can, so you get this kind of, this bell shape here is also very stereotypical. It's one of these tremendously robust invariants in motor behavior, which is the one that you, this one is when you come in contact with the surface, and then you have these motor programs that are really strong and make you work, behave always the same way. And then pushing is one of them. You always get a very nicely timed bell-shaped curve when you ask people to push on the surface, which is very useful for Apple to make good clicks. But that aside, here you essentially the deflection of each of these little surfaces is essentially a periodic function of the load. Okay, so so you have a periodic function of the load, meaning that if the argument varies fast, then you have more oscillations. And what happens is like phenomenologically, when you actually push on this particular case here, you feel your finger moving through the surface, but not by a small amount, by like many millimeters. So it's like as if your finger is going through the surface. As if it was completely soft, but you have really the sensation of movement in your finger when actually the surface is rigid. And in the second case, which actually creates a lot more stimulation, you feel a perfect rigidity, perfect immobility. So that's how do you explain that? So that's the results, of course. You get a very nice relationship between the rates and the amplitudes for most people. And then for the antiphase control case, then you have absolutely no sensation of displacement. So the way we explained it, it's again going back to the granular materials. The granular materials, that's what they do. They when you compress sand or coffee beans or wood, actually, is the same. The number of mechanical events per unit of time is proportional to the rate. Okay, so that's, and it comes basically from conservation of energy. And that's the way you dissipate the energy acoustically and mechanically. And so you can actually verify it. If you put a bag full of beads on a force sensor and you push on it, you get this response. And you get actually, from a statistical viewpoint, the same profile with our in-phase stimulus, but not for the antiphase. And so you would say, but this is weird because you are talking here about statistical recording, where in fact your stimulus was perfectly deterministic. It's just a sine function. But it's not counting, it's discounting a very important fact in somatosensation and motor behavior, that actually whenever you move, there is always, you never move exactly the same way, and you have quite a bit of noise in your motor system, and also quite a bit of noise in your sensory system, which actually means that the deterministic stimulus is actually never the same. And so the stochasticity that we recorded here is actually due to the fact that you never really move and you have a bit of tremor also and so on. There is a lot of non-deterministic components. We replicated the similar study here with using still the same way of thinking with colleagues at that time that was in colleagues in Pisa. Essentially observing that whenever you touch an object, then the contact that you make with the object depends on how much you push. So if I push, make a small contact and push more, I get a bigger contact. And normally when you push on things, your brain assumes that the surface that you are pushing on doesn't move. It's very important. So, and it's an assumption, actually. If you realize it, think of an animal or even a robot pushing on a concrete wall, then almost every sensor in your body or in the robot's body will give you a signal, which is related to the load that you are applying. And through the feet and through the hands and the skin, everything responds. But if the wall is a little elastic, you have the sensation of elasticity, but basically the neural response is basically the same because you're loading. So how on earth can you tell that something's moving from something that's not moving? So the idea behind these two experiments is actually that the brain is making an assumption about the nature of what you touch. And that's what determines the sensation of your own state. So it's the knowledge of the external world that tell you what is the state of your own body. It's not necessarily a sensory experience. It's really an inference based on what your brain assumes the world is made. And then here, we just violate that assumption with that apparatus. Here, what it does is it actually changes the nature of the contact as you push. And then it gives you the sensation of moving your finger when actually it's not moving. Simply because that relationship is reproduced. Oh yes, I wanted to speak about mechanics again because it's really sort of fundamentally important to touch the way mechanics work. And I mentioned friction was important, clearly. And here, and friction actually, counterintuitively, is very much driven by the presence of water. So, because our skin is a biological tissue, it's always wet. It has to be, because it's alive. And the wetness makes it give it frictional properties that are quite unique, very different from wood or metal or plastic. And so we realized that in that earlier study here, by noticing that actually the gripping behavior was very dependent on humidity. And the observation is that if you have dry hands, then you tend to squeeze more for the same object. Okay. So that's been verified many times. But the question is why? So the easy answer is that actually the skin is more slippery when it's dry. And it's true to a certain extent. But what is more interesting, actually, is shown on that graph here, is actually you can, on the abscissa here, you have how much you load a contact. And the ordinate, you have the ratio of the part that skin that's slipping to the part of the skin that's not sticking. So you could have the stick ratio. So when it's 1, you have a good lift. When it's 0, it's finished. And you have everything in between. Okay? And then what is interesting is that the moisture in your skin changes the slope. And that's really interesting because it means that why is it suggests that actually you squeeze more when you have dry hands. It's not because you get more friction, it's because you give your brain the option of anticipating more, because the distance from a good grip to catastrophe is smaller when it's dry. So essentially what your brain has learned to do is to increase that distance for safety. So what you are seeing here, there is a well-known technique to measure something in mechanics. It's called the true contact. So when you have two objects that are coming in close contact, touching actually, you have the intuition that they create a surface. We talked about the surface many times. But in reality, that surface can be very, very small, like if really at atomic scale. And so your body is covered by a material called keratin, which is the same as your hair, but it's the outer layer of the skin. And the keratin, at least the type that makes your outer skin, has mostly, it's actually has, so keratin comes either in a crystal state or in an amorphous state. And when it's dry, essentially it is in a crystal state and it's incredibly strong. But when it becomes wet, it becomes much more elastic and even becomes plastic. And in mechanical terms, the Young modulus actually increases or changes by a factor 100, even 1,000. So it's a tremendous mechanical change according to the level of moisture in your skin. And the result is if you have a dry finger that touches a piece of glass and you measure the true contact, so really where the surfaces interact at atomic scale, like they're close enough actually to create frictional forces, then the true contact is very small. And I'll show you actually it's so small that you can see it evolving through time. If you keep your finger on the surface, and it takes a good 10 seconds, if not 20 seconds, actually for the keratin to trap the water that is present inside your finger between the glass and the finger, and then create a sufficient amount of moisture that will make the keratin become plastic. And it takes a long time. It takes 10 seconds. And you can wait more, actually. It'll saturate eventually. At 60 seconds, it saturates. And it's really amazing because this something you've never realized in your life, that actually when you hold a surface which is smooth, impermeable, and atomically flat, which is the case of a glass or a plastic cup, then the friction takes a long time to evolve. It takes essentially 20 seconds before you have a good grip. And so there are so many mechanical phenomena that are taking place without you realizing. That is really poses question about how is it possible that actually your somatosensory system can function in these conditions of extreme variability. So that picture can be supported by essentially graphs. So you can see that actually when you are holding an object, then the gross surface, the one you imagine, is immediately created as soon as you grip, as the node increases, but actually the true contact takes a long time to become established. And what is more interesting is that if you touch something else than glass, then say plastic or this paper here, or this fabric, then each time you get a different evolution, of course, because the behavior of water depends on the counter surface. If you have something porous, then the water is actually evacuated, and the friction actually takes even more time to be created. If you have a surface that is rough, but then when I mean rough, maybe a few microns of roughness, then you have a completely different evolution also, because these are things that happen at atomic level. And that's really interesting because it really shows how actually this dynamics gives you information, I mean, seems to be giving all the information that is necessary to identify materials, like what I mentioned at the beginning. Like you know, the glass or the stone or the wood. It really has to do with this domain of tribology, which studies the dynamics of how friction evolves through time and through all kind of other factors. So that's why we call the paper rubber. No, why is it like you like to have paper with rubber grips? It's because the rubber, at the moment of contact, is a lot more soft than the keratin. The keratin looks like the Alps, you know, it has, or the Pyrenees. It has like points, and it's very complicated. But if it's pushed against a soft material, then the contact is made immediately. So it's not the finger, it's the material that makes the contact. So that's the point. That makes a rubbery grip feel secure.